Willard. He's going to give us a brief history of St. Barnabas Church.
Hi, this is just a couple of pictures showing some views around St. Barnabas Episcopal Church in Sykesville, Maryland. It was the cornerstone was laid in June 1850, as this slide shows. Everyone is welcome. The one noteworthy thing about our parish is it is truly an open, warm, and loving community that welcomes all. It has a long history. Many of these pictures shows the church back in the 1840s and the 1850s. Originally, St. Barnabas was founded out of its mother parish, St. Paul's Episcopal Church in downtown Baltimore. And there's a history of chapels of ease being founded. First, St. Thomas Episcopal Church in Harrison Forest, and then later, Holy Trinity Church in Eldersburg was formed. This slide shows who the vestry were in the late 1700s prior to the Revolutionary War, and it shows that names that are still common in our community: Brown, Tivis, Dorsey, and Warfields were some of the early church leaders. And it also talks about Reverend Robert Strawbridge was one of the early United Methodist founders. And in fact, at New Windsor, there's a Strawbridge United Methodist Church that's still in business to this day, that dates clear back to the Revolutionary War period. This slide shows Susanna Warfield, who was one of the early founders of St. Barnabas. She lived 90 some odd years. She petitioned Bishop William Whittingham to build a chapel of ease in Sykesville, Maryland. And she and James Sykes, the founder of Sykesville, and Susanna's parents were all busy with the vestry and supporting the church and then building the church for the community of Sykesville. The earlier church in Eldersburg had been Holy Trinity Episcopal Church. This slide shows Holy Trinity. It's no longer there. Today, if you were to go to this location, you'd see that that ground grows a really fine garden. The old cemetery for Holy Trinity is still there today, and many of the early congregants are buried there at Holy Trinity, just behind the Bob Evans restaurant in Eldersburg. A couple of slides of the Bibles used at Holy Trinity in the early 1800s. The picture to the left is Reverend Robert Pickett. He lived in Sykesville, was the Episcopal priest, and is buried at Holy Trinity Church. When he died in the late 1800s, he was then the oldest living Episcopal minister in the United States. This picture to our right here actually shows Deacon Poole, later to become Father Poole, who was holding services in the old Holy Trinity Church in Eldersburg. This slide shows nothing more than the location of the old Holy Trinity Church. If you fast forward to all the way up to 1850, you'll see Sykesville was a growing community. James Sykes was in town. He had built property and a cotton and grist mill, had a factory, and were employing immigrants from England and Wales. Sykesville was growing. The bottom left picture shows the old Sykes Hotel, and the bottom right picture does as well. And it actually shows Sykesville before it was it even had a paved road. The Chapel of Ease in Sykesville was born. Susanna Warfield to the left and Bishop Whittingham. When Barnabas was created, actually Whittingham traveled from downtown Baltimore to Sykesville. I assume on a horse. He might have taken the train. We actually have his minutes. He traveled 27 miles. Met at the James Sykes home, where they had a congregation walk to the church, and they laid the cornerstone with 200 people in attendance. This slide shows his notes from where he was in town. Later, the Holy Trinity Church became abandoned. It was used as a stable where they kept horses and cows and goats. Just prior to that, the Baptist in the Eldersburg area had used the church for their services. This slide shows an early Episcopal rectory that was built here in Sykesville in the late 1800s. It still stands today. If you go up College Avenue, you can drive right to and look down on this church, and it looks almost identical. Susanna Warfield's picture to the left. To the right is the what I believe is the old Warfield Plantation, later to become the Warfield Academy for Boys. It was an Episcopal championed college for youth males. Across the street, after Sykes had died, Marion Hugg purchased the property. He was the son of Jacob Hugg, a very successful Baltimore mariner. And this building stood in what is now woods. There's old ruins and foundations. This mansion actually burned in the 1930s. Just a couple pictures from downtown Sykesville in 1920s. The bottom picture shows a church bazaar where many of the congregations from the various churches held their services here. This picture shows the Holy Trinity Episcopal Cemetery in Eldersburg, of which also there's an Episcopal cemetery at the St. Barnabas Church, both with people interred who were born in the Revolutionary and colonial period. Another picture of the cemetery. This picture actually shows the Warfield site, which has in it buried George Fraser Warfield, his wife Rebecca Brown Warfield, and Susanna Warfield and her brother William Henry. The windows in the church are absolutely beautiful. If anybody could come, they'll see the Christ window at the altar, also the various colored glass windows, all date back to the 1800s and were given by or for or in memory of the Warfield family or various relatives and associated families. More slides that show those. There's a lot of memorials to different people who have been significant champions in the church, and if you tour the church sometime, you'll be able to see all the names that are noteworthy. And there's many people been generous for a lot of years.
It is Thursday, April 7th, 2011, and I am here with Eleanor Mercer and Ross Brooks, some of the historians from here at St. Barnabas. Just going to ask you some questions about the history of the church here. I had asked you this before. When do you think the congregation was at its largest, at its smallest? Is it a growing congregation?
Well, it's probably at its largest right now. I can remember when I first started to attend that there might be 15 people on a Sunday, and we shared a minister, a priest from St. John's at Ellicott City, and he would run up and do one service at St. Barnabas and then jump in his car and run to St. John's at Ellicott City and preach his next service. So I think that might have been the smallest congregation at that time.
Okay. And are there differences among the members of the church, or is it a pretty homogeneous group?
Oh, I think we've blended pretty well, but of course there's the old-timers and the new-timers. But I think that's typical of every church.
Good. And who was the church established to serve originally? Like what kind of community would the church have seen in its early days?
A farm community.
Well, also it was originated to serve the communicants that were living in Sykesville, who had been brought over from, well, actually they emigrated from England and Wales, and this was encouraged by James Sykes, naturally to work at his factory and factories, I should say. And when they came over, they were, for the most part, they had to be Church of England members, so the faith was very, very similar. Well, historically it follows from Henry VIII on down. But I guess that's about it.
And what kind of effect did the church have, or did the church history have on the Civil War in the area?
Well, we were in the middle of it, so to speak. I know the congregation then was, there was some division in the congregation. Some northern sympathizers and other southern sympathizers Warfields, as an example, who were direct sponsors of the formulation of the present church. They had some slave owners, and they were slave owners, and they encouraged their slaves to go to St. Barnabas. And for that reason, there is a balcony that was built for the slaves, the seating of the slaves, and which was very common during that period. And
That's okay. You had mentioned something about some Civil War soldiers marching through town.
oh yes, General Stewart of the CSA had two columns. Actually, there was one column came right up present Route 32 and marched through town. And when they did that, they caught a couple of sentries, Union sentries, on the bridge, and they were supposed to be guarding it, and they were promptly taken by as prisoners. And then, of course, as the column neared, the bridge was fired, and there was another column that went up through Hood's Mill, and they joined up on or on Liberty Road, just above the town, Eldersburg, and then together they went up to Westminster. And I guess you know about the little battle that was fought in Westminster. And let's see, anything else? Yeah, it was. I would imagine if I was a communicant at the time and standing in front of St. Barnabas Church, I could probably see the column as it passed by.
Okay. You had mentioned that the St. Barnabas Parish House was used for a lot of local church bazaars and as a community meeting place. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
I guess it was in 1950s. We had the largest meeting place around, and we would sponsor a country fair, and the different churches around would each rent a table, and the ladies would display their needlework, their knitting, their artwork. Remember the Jones sisters, local artists in Sykesville, would have a table, and St. Joe's had a table, and the Methodists had a table. So it was a good time had by all, and all of the churches joined in and made some money.
Very nice.
It generally lasted, what, 3 days?
3 days. And we had meals, sold food, so it was very nice.
Very exciting. You had talked a little bit about some services in your earlier days of the church that were done by candlelight.
Yes, I remember attending a Christmas Eve service where the church was lit by candlelight, and I was very impressed. I was a Methodist, so I went with my to-be husband, and I thought it was just beautiful. Of course, St. Barnabas is very beautiful inside, and there was 2 great big candelabras that had double rows of candles that went up. They're now at the Museum of Sykesville, and of course we were always amused because the little acolytes sometimes couldn't reach all the way up to light the candles, and sometimes they almost knocked the candles out onto the floor, but that made things exciting.
There you go. How did World War II affect not just the church but the community?
Well, you would notice that some of the farmers wouldn't make it to the Sunday services because they were out in their fields working, because everybody in the U.S. worked around the clock every day, the factories and everything else, so the farmers also were out harvesting and plowing and doing their thing too.
Had a little taste of the, not the real war, but the real enemy opposition. They were brought into the area and they were allowed to work on farms.
Prisoners of war.
Yeah, prisoners of war. And I know that happened in Howard County as well as
we
here
had
too.
some on our farm, and a guard or two guards would drive them in the morning, and they would work on the farm. We'd have to feed them, and of course they'd sit around talking German, and we didn't know what they were saying. But it was very interesting. I know I was scared to death, but they were probably very glad to be working on a farm instead of shooting each other and us.
I know my wife had an aunt just across the river on Route, 7, I guess it is. In any event, she and her friend would come up and stay with her aunt for the summer. And that was one of the interesting things that they were aware of. Some of these German soldiers apparently were quite good looking.
Right. Blondes.
Blonde, many of them, and they would flirt with them.
Right. That's true. And you'd fix a great big thrashing meal in the center of the day, middle of the day, and it was a lot of work, but they did the farm work.
Very interesting. What about some of the more current conflicts? You had some soldiers and sailors overseas for the Gulf Wars and Afghanistan?
One of our communicants was a reserve naval officer, and he was displaced from his family and put in Kuwait. And I think he was over there for about 6 months. And I used to communicate on a regular basis with him, you know, letter writing and that sort of thing. He said after he got back, you know, I always enjoyed receiving mail, and naturally every serviceman does. And he shared a number of my letters with some of the other fellows too. So.
And that's part of our outreach too. We do send packages overseas to our servicemen. You know, playing cards, candy, books, whatever we think that they could use. So we still do that.
Very good. And I guess could you just talk a little bit about September 11th and how that affected the church and the community and how the church responded to that?
Well, you want to talk to?
No, I don't.
Well, in any event,
Father Earl touched on that.
yes, he did, and he called a meeting for the evening of September the 11th, 1951.
Yeah.
I mean, 1991, I believe it was. Anyhow, and just about everybody in the parish attended, and it was very prayerful, and for the most part, it was very supportive. Like any other group, there were a few people that were against the Gulf War, and I think most of us were against war in general, but by the same token, we had no choice. And so from that standpoint, it stood alone. I don't know whether any other churches in the community had similar services, but they probably did.
It was like grief counseling. We got up and we, you know, spoke about how we felt about it, and that was most of the service. And then, of course, we had a prayer service afterward.
Okay. Anything else you guys want to talk about that the church does or has done in the past, or affect that it's had on the community at all? Anything really that you want to talk about?
Not that I know of.
I know we are an annual participant in the annual Sykesville celebration. And for the most part, we serve food. And
Don't forget our pancakes. Shrove Tuesday.
oh, that's right. That's right.
We have a reputation for our Shrove Tuesday pancake day.
Yes.
Sausage and pancakes. We have quite a following. But mostly I would like to say that we're a friendly church and we welcome everyone.
Well, all right.